Well, thank you all so much for joining us for today's program, George Tooker, Modern Life and Magical Realism. George Tooker often depicted the tensions of modern life and inhuman bureaucracies. As a gay man active in the civil rights movement, Tooker explored boundary-breaking subjects in his work while also conjuring powerful scenes of quiet beauty. So we're going to enjoy an introduction to this artist, his life, and his remarkable body of work. And this is all led by the one and only art historian Jane Oneail, founder of Culturally Curious, a company that curates and delivers art appreciation programs for audiences worldwide. With a master's in art history from Boston University and a master's in education from Harvard University, Jane has worked at some of New Hampshire's most esteemed cultural institutions, including as executive director of the League of New Hampshire Craftsmen, as well as senior educator at the Currier Museum of Art. Jane has also taught at the college level for more than a decade, most recently at Southern New Hampshire University. So all 75 plus of us who are watching live and the many more that will watch the recording, let's give a big virtual round of applause to Jane for joining us here this morning. And Jane, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Robert. Thank you, everybody, for taking time out of your day to learn a little bit more about George Tooker. In my opinion, he's one of art history's best kept secrets. So now you're going to be in the know. After this next hour, he created these incredible, realistic, surrealistic images in the 20th century. We've got a little preview of one on the screen. We'll be getting back to this image over the course of the hour. It's haunting, it's beautiful, it's mysterious. Let me give you a sense in terms of how we're going to spend our time together today. Here's our program overview and another unusual image from the artist. It's called Festa. You can feast your eyes on it. As I go through this, we're going to start off with an introduction to the artist and just this concept of magical realism. What does that really entail? You see a little bit of it over here with these kind of repeated figures. In this case, a woman whose eyes almost look like they are all dark here, repeated architecture, almost like an austere space that's been sort of pared down. We'll get a little deeper into it along the way. We'll look at his public pictures, his images with social commentary. Those are some of his best known images. And then I've devised these different themes, just basically looking at his body of work. There are themes that he loved to return to again and again across the years. And I've grouped them together to give us this sense of a progression in those themes. So we have windows and doors, light and love, sleep and death, and then we'll wrap up with the artist's legacy. So let's dive right into the artist's life and magical realism here. Here is George Tooker as a little boy and as a young man. He was born in 1920 in Brooklyn, and he was raised Episcopalian, which kind of factors in because religion ends up being a big part of his life. Now, his mother was half Cuban, and so he thought of himself as mixed race, although clearly we can see that he easily passed as a white man. At age 7, he began taking painting lessons, so art was a big part of his life from the get-go. And even though he came from a solidly middle-class background, he did end up attending Phillips Academy in Andover, and then he went on to Harvard, where he studied literature, but the whole time he was kind of longing to paint. So it was as a young person, maybe because of this feeling of being on the outside, being mixed race, or potentially because of being gay, he developed this this sense of empathy that I think really comes through in so many of his images. And the fact that he was gay in America at a time when it was not necessarily socially acceptable and nor was it safe, he was out. He embraced who he was, and he lived an authentic life. Now, after college, he moved to New York City to study painting at the Art Students League. And he had several instructors there, but one of them was Reginald Marsh, who was an artist focused very much on the social scene in New York City at the time. So this is an example of a Reginald Marsh painting. This is the kind of lesson that George Tooker was getting as a young man. And Reginald Marsh is interested in social realism. This is a work called The Subway from 1930, and we get the sense of movement, of people flooding off of a train, going about their daily lives. And Marsh loves to tell us, the details, the information about women's dresses, how people are individually kind of activated in the space, whether they're looking for something in their purse, fixing their hair, reading a newspaper. It's all kind of a flurry of activity. And we can see over on the right that Tooker was kind of trying to internalize that as a young artist. This is his nod to social realism, a la his teacher, Reginald Marsh. So we have a woman sitting on a subway train, and she's actively reading a newspaper. And with a work like this, we can see that he's interested in modern life. He hasn't yet landed on his approach to it yet. And as it turns out, it's not so much his teacher that influenced him, but the people in his social sphere. So these are two works that are not by George Tooker. Instead, they're by artists that he was associated with. In fact, he dated both of them. So this is over here on the left, a work by the artist Paul Cadmus, and it's called The Fleet's Inn. And we can see these kind of monumental bodies. They're really solid forms here, all interacting with each other. There is a little bit of a sense of repetition in those forms. And even though some of them are in dynamic poses, particularly this foreshortened arm here, we don't really get a sense of movement. They almost look more like statues frozen in time. Over here on the right, we have a work by an artist named William Christopher. This is from a little bit later, but this is emblematic of Christopher's work. And what we see is sort of the repetition of a particular person. This is a little bit of magical realism too. And so these kinds of ideas were deeply influential to young George Tooker. And William Christopher, the artist, ends up becoming essentially George Tooker's life partner. This is the two artists. They met in New York City as young men. So they developed this strong relationship with each other. They are essentially the loves of each other's lives. And they connected in the mid 1950s and stayed together right up until 1973 when William Christopher died. Now, following his death, George Tooker lives for another 40 years or so, and never seeks out another romantic relationship. So for the most part, when we think about his homosexuality, George Tooker's artwork is understood to kind of reference sexuality implicitly instead of explicitly. And I think you see that a little bit in this early work over here on the right. It's from 1946 and it's called Children and Spastics. But this might be his most direct commentary on homosexuality, if you are to agree with the art historians on this one. So what we see here are five children, five little kids who are dressed in black and gray here, and they are kind of menacing these three adult men who are very pale and all wearing these sort of pastel colors. Now they have things like brooms and bags on their head, but they seem like they're ready for war, right? They even have this little dog here, like an attack dog. And these men have these bare arms. They seem really vulnerable and they seem like they're being mocked. Of course, the title here, Spastics, implies that they have a medical malady, but there's some of the gestures here that I think were kind of closely associated with being a gay man, especially at this time in America. So it seems as though Tooker could be making a commentary in this work informed by his own experiences. Now, we do have this fantastic self-portrait produced by George Tooker when he was about 27 years old. This is from the following year. This is 1947. It's a round painting or a tondo format. It's roughly 16 inches in diameter. Almost makes you feel like you're looking into a mirror. And what we can see here is that Tooker has shaved his head very close to his scalp here, and it's emphasized the roundness of his head. And then we begin to see all these round elements in the picture too, from his eyeballs to the nautilus to the architectural details, even to this very solid knot of the sweater that he's tied around his shoulders. It's a completely unnecessary sweater, by the way, too, because he's already got a sweater on. So here he is kind of reinforcing the volume of his neck in the way that it supports this head of his. So it's such a striking painting. I love this painting, but it's good for us to keep in mind that it's sort of out. Oh, well, first of all, look at how close it is to the artist's likeness here. Photograph from him around the same time. Maybe the neck isn't quite as big in real life, but it's important for us to keep in mind that this is really out of sync with what was happening in the art world at the time. Going over to Jackson Pollock now, who in the same year, 1947, was already creating these all over drip and splatter paintings. This is full fathom 5 on the right. So this was considered avant-garde. This was modern art in the 1940s. And Tooker sort of seems like he's taking a step back in some ways by staying connected to realism in this way. But he never cared if he was going to become a household name. He didn't really want to become famous, and he didn't particularly like the New York scene either. So he wasn't chasing down success in the same way that maybe somebody like Jackson Pollock needed to. So what we're looking at here is a photograph of George Tooker, kind of posed as though he's working in this chair, and it provides a great opportunity for us to talk about how he created his paintings. This is an image over here on the right of a carton of eggs that he painted in 1963. This is at the Hood Museum in Dartmouth. And it seems, well, it is a little bit of a tour de force of painting because it's a white on white painting. It gets a lot of subtlety there. But it would be a familiar subject to this artist because he was working in egg tempera throughout his life. We've all probably used tempera paints before to paint a poster. They dry nice and quickly, usually have this kind of matte finish to them. But egg tempera is kind of an antique way of painting. You're actually using egg yolks as a binding agent for your pigment. So you kind of continuously have to move it around, and you kind of have to work in this slow, well, relatively slow, measured style, but you're working against the clock in some sense because of the nature of that egg yolk and how it dries. So when I say it's an antique way of working, it is the way, it's the tools, essentially, the ingredients that pre-Renaissance artists were using. Even Botticelli, an early Italian Renaissance artist, was working with egg yolk tempera. This is, of course, the detail of his Venus from the famous Birth of Venus. So going back to the 1400s, artists were using this. They largely abandoned this method, this practice by the 20th century because oil paints are just a little bit more fluid. They're easier for a lot of artists to work with. But Tooker is committed to it. And I think even in this image over here on the right, you sort of get the sense that he's creating his own nod to the Venus here. Notice how these women's heads are kind of hinged on their necks in a similar way with the hair blowing across their faces. So tempera is usually applied in very thin, kind of semi-opaque or transparent layers. It's a long process. It's a slow burn. Normally with egg tempera, you don't see this kind of saturated color. Think more like Andrew Wyeth. Things are usually a little bit more muted and dark, but George Tooker was able to create these rather vibrant paintings that sometimes almost look more like pastels to me. So we have the sense in terms of the materials that he was using, a little bit more about his process here. And I'm sorry for the graininess of the picture on the left. On the right, we see the final image, which is called the Bird Watchers. And this is an example of one of the preparatory sketches that he would make, where you can see he's really focusing on composition here, on geometries, on harmonies, and he would take a long time just to figure out those proportions in a picture and then create a grid over it and transfer the image sort of square by square into the final painting. So as I said, these took a long time. He would usually make about 3 paintings a year, and they are carefully planned out. There are no accidents in a George Tooker painting. We've got a great self-portrait over here on the left. This is, again, sort of informal, looks almost casual. I believe it's from the 1980s. But the more time you spend with it, the more you see those underlying geometries here, a nice little V shape, maybe a nice triangle that's dividing up the canvas this way, and a nice trompe-l'oeil effect as well. We'll see a lot of that. The trompe-l'oeil is a French art term, which literally means fool the eye. And it usually refers to these little elements that, in a picture that look like they're pushing out into our space. So the picture stops becoming a window onto a world. It's like the window is being broken through. Uh, Now, a little bit more about Tooker's life before I plunge into this work over here on the right. Now, Tooker and William Christopher start spending weekends and vacations in Vermont, and they move there full time in 1960 so that William Christopher can work at Dartmouth College. And it's this nice, quiet life that appeals to both of them. It suits them so much better than the city. But Tooker stays very engaged with the issues that always mattered to him, even back when he was living in the city. So he and Christopher, they actually joined Dartmouth College's NAACP chapter, even though I think it was essentially all white students there at the time. In 1965, he traveled down to Alabama to take part in pivotal civil rights marches from Selma to Montgomery. So he's there and he's marching with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So on the right, we can see this more mysterious self-portrait. Here he has these heavy lidded eyes, sort of tired looking, and his face is sort of compressed with a hand on top and a hand on the bottom. The hand on the bottom is his hand. He looks like he's holding a paintbrush. Maybe it's like a gesture of contemplation here. But who is this figure behind him? It looks like some sort of ambiguous angel, right? There appear to be wings. There's light emanating from behind this figure who appears to be African American, and their eyes are cast down as well. Are they both contemplating a painting? Is this figure behind him guiding him, inspiring him, controlling him? We don't quite know, but we do know that Tooker, as somebody who identified as mixed race, was extremely sympathetic to social justice issues during his lifetime. Now, his partner, William Christopher, passes away in the 70s, as I mentioned, and Tooker, who was raised Episcopalian, converts to Catholicism and becomes deeply involved in his church and in his own spirituality there in Windsor, Vermont. So in the last few decades of his life, Tooker would essentially, well, he had this pattern. He would attend mass every single day in the morning, return home, paint until sort of sundown, and then spend the evenings just sketching. He sort of becomes like an artistic monk to a certain extent. And he worked just like that, right up until his death in 2011. I love this picture of him kind of peering out towards us here. So there's a fair amount of his work up at Dartmouth. Now, just to touch on magical realism before we switch gears here, it's kind of fun to think about. And I'm just tickled by this comparison on the screen. It's like a study of opposites, right? We have 3 kind of watchful, slightly anxious women here, and then 3 men who are sleeping or kind of unconscious. We have indoors, we have outdoors. And in both of these images, we get a little bit of that magical realism because it seems as though the figures aren't distinct from each other. They seem sort of like copy paste, right? Already there's an element here that doesn't quite make sense and takes us out of our lived experience in the real world into almost like a parallel universe. There's also almost like a sense of timelessness in these images, because even though the figures seem to be wearing modern clothes or these jeans or these dresses from the 1940s or something, they're lacking just enough detail to pin it down to a particular style, a particular decade. So they seem like they're of the modern era, but almost like beyond the modern era at the same time. So so there's the mystery that he includes here that I think keeps us coming back again and again. I love this stylized beach over here, and that Tooker doesn't tell us why these men are here. Has there been a shipwreck? Has there been a late night party? He lets us fill in the blanks with both of these scenes. And so let's see what more he has in store for us. Let's turn our attention to his social commentary works, his public works. Now, he is known for these paintings about kind of impersonal bureaucracies. And this particular painting called Government Bureau is in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, dates to 1956. And it's based on his own experience. It's based on all of our experiences, right? This feels like going to the DMV. This feels like going through the security line at the airport. And Tooker was maybe one of the first artists to document that impersonal bureaucratic experience in this psychologically perceptive way. And of course, he based this on his experience. He and William Christopher were renovating a brownstone in Brooklyn, and his experience going to try and get the permits was just so exasperating. He was inspired to make this scene. So notice that each one of these bureaucrats is this man with the dark circles under his eyes, the furrowed brow, and this look of absolute exhaustion. It's like they've given up on life here. They're hidden behind this frosted glass, and we can only see their eyes, their nose, maybe an ear. We also see their fingers on these like counting machines. And the people waiting to be processed by these bureaucrats are also kind of copy and paste. This figure is essentially identical to the figure at the center. The women all seem to be wearing similar headscarves and jackets of the same length. So it's almost like a dreamscape in some ways. It's hard to make sense out of. The architecture seems to go on forever. How big is this space? How long does it take you to get through? Notice that our vantage point as a viewer here is really from very low down. It's almost like we're looking at this from a child's perspective, and it adds this sense of dread and terror when you're looking at something like this. For Tooker, this represented the misuse of authority without responsibility. So this idea that, they don't have to process you any faster than they want to, and how frustrating that is. Perhaps his best known image is this one here. It's called The Subway. This is from 1950. It's at the Whitney Museum. And once again, this is something that we're all familiar with. We've all been in a space like this. We've felt this way. Maybe you were in a parking garage late at night or in the bowels of some sort of enormous building. Here we have Tooker capturing this unique fear of modern city life, this subterranean labyrinth that you have to navigate in order to get around town. And it's filled with these sour, kind of soulless looking ghouls. They're just kind of strangers to each other. And it's a reminder that when you go down into the subway in major cities, it's like all of the social niceties that you experience above ground are null and void. People don't look each other in the eye. They don't acknowledge each other. People kind of close themselves off from each other. And we see that sense of terror and dread in this central female figure. she's the person who seems to be looking about, trying to make sense of this. She has this very large hand, and it's placed over her abdomen, almost suggesting a pregnancy and an additional vulnerability beyond being a woman in this kind of unknowable space. So Tooker used something like three different vanishing points in terms of how he laid out this complex geometric space. We don't see any trains. We just see endless passageways, these kind of niches here. Maybe these are for phones. And we see people lost in these kind of desperate psychological moments. Somebody who just seems to be standing there deep in thought, somebody looking over their shoulder with fear in their eye, somebody who seems to be having a breakdown up against the wall here. It's really kind of an extraordinary study of the modern experience of anxiety. And I will zoom in for you just all the way down at the end of this hall. There's another woman in a red dress, and she is just such a strange character to me. She almost looks like she's wearing a crown. She's got like an animal fur over her shoulders, and she seems to be kind of crouching up against the wall in this space that none of us would choose to dwell in or spend any time in. I always felt like George Tooker was kind of creating this queen of the underworld that you really kind of had to study in order to find. So as he's creating something like this, these big figures that don't really feel like they're moving per se, they're in a posture of moving, they're kind of frozen in time. This is Tooker once again thinking of the early Italian Renaissance. So these other artists that were working with egg yolk tempera. So this is an example of one of those artists' work. This is Piero della Francesca, and this is just one painting here, but you can see how he's broken up the space and he's using perspective in order to show us figures that are monumental in the foreground and with this storytelling in the background. And I think you get a little bit of that with Tooker's subway painting as well. It's an expression of a modern state that I think still resonates today. Oh, before I move on to that, it's important to compare this to his teacher's work as well, who was also painting the subway 20 years earlier. For Reginald Marsh, it was about movement, it's about activity, it's about being of the moment, showing a newspaper from that very day. And for Tooker, there's something more timeless. There's something immobile about his expression of the subway here. And just to bring it into present day, there's a photographer who named Paul Vandekar who did a series of photos kind of updating the painting back in 2016 as people were feeling very anxious about the presidential election at the time. He was recreating George Tooker's paintings in order to express that. So clearly his images still resonate today. As we continue on, Tooker continued to explore this theme of these kind of soulless spaces. This is called Waiting Room from 1959. This is at the Smithsonian. And it's another iteration of a particularly 20th century brand of anxiety and alienation. We are looking at people who are in waiting rooms, waiting to live their lives, and there's like no end in sight. Notice how these stalls are numbered. We're up above 100 here, 115, 116, 117. What are these stalls for? This seems like again, this kind of infinite architectural space where you lose your identity. We have people, most of the figures here, we can only see little fragments of their faces. It's hard to know exactly what they're thinking or feeling. Even the figure whose face we see the most of, his eyes are obscured because of those glasses. We do see one figure here who appears to be sleeping, or maybe more than that. Maybe he's passed on. It's hard to say. How long have they been waiting? It does seem like they're waiting for something monumental. This figure here, or these two figures, seem as though they're embracing and kind of steadying each other. Notice that the one face that you do see is this kind of awful grimace on the back of a magazine that's positioned in front of this woman's head. She seems like another queen of the underworld, right? Right at the center of this composition. So this waiting room is a purgatory. It's just a space where you wait for an indefinite amount of time. It's not about living at all, is it? So it Tooker takes this theme and he makes it even more abstract. And whenever I look at this picture, I'm always reminded of office cubicles. If you've ever worked in one, you might have felt this way before. This is called Landscape with Figures from 1966. It's this endless sea of boxes, each one of them containing a human being. Once again, the built environment here is dehumanizing and it's isolating. It's interesting because this picture sort of glows, and like so many other Tooker paintings, the light source is unknown, it's unseen. There seems to be a light source here and maybe one in the back. Some of the faces we can see in these cubes, some of them tilt their head back, some of them have their eyes closed, but most of them seem to have their heads bowed. We don't know them. But two of the figures in the foreground, these two figures here, seem to tentatively raise their eyes and look beyond these enclosures. So maybe there's like this sense of an awakening. This almost reminds me of like the concept of the Matrix in the Matrix movie. Now, believe it or not, in 1968, shortly after this picture was finished, a steel company reached out to George Tooker and asked if they could use this image to recruit new employees. Can you imagine who would want to work there? Tooker declined it, stating specifically he did not want to be a part of the military-industrial complex. So if this is working in hell, perhaps this is what the break room looks like there. This is called Lunch from 1964. And we can see that people are compressed into these tiny, tight rows, these skinny counters to consume their meals. Their heads are bent, their eyes are cast down. This is not a place where people connect. This figure here, too, is like turning away so he can sip his coffee as though he doesn't want anybody to see him eating. So this is like, I mean, it's a nightmare, right? When we think of breaking bread, and all these people who seem to be eating their sandwiches, we think of a sense of community and we think of an opportunity to connect. And everybody here is avoiding that, really trying to avoid that. Now, there is an additional social commentary in this work because the only full face that we see is this African American man at the center. This is an integrated lunch counter. So it's important for us to keep in mind that in 1964, when this was painted, there were cities throughout the South that saw nonviolent protesters integrating lunch counters as part of the civil rights movement and the fight for equality. For George Tooker, this was a subtle nod to these changing politics, and this was a direction that he was happy to see the country moving in. So the last image that we'll look at from this section on social commentary also speaks to Tooker's interest in equality and civil rights. This is called Supper from 1963. Once again, we see a Black man who is kind of the center of attention when it comes to having a meal. He's flanked by these two white men who look almost identical. You could probably make the case that they are self-portraits of the artist. And the Black man is holding the bread here. He's clearly the protagonist. Now, an image like this probably reminds you of religious imagery, specifically the kind of history of painting around a particular scene in the life of Christ called Supper at Emmaus. This is an example of one such portrayal of that scene. And essentially what happens at the Supper of Emmaus is Christ has been resurrected and he comes back to these two apostles who don't recognize him because he's kind of incognito. And the moment he breaks the bread, his apostles realize that he has been resurrected. So this is kind of the same setup that Tooker gives us. And now the idea that the disguise here is that he's a Black man. And Tooker is very specifically saying this because he so admired Dr. Martin Luther King. He thought of his actions and his public life as being very Christ-like. So another another very strong political message in this particular painting. So we're going to switch gears now and turn our attention to more kind of abstracted ideas that that preoccupied Tooker throughout his career. And these are just themes that I've kind of pulled together out of his body of work. But he does seem to go back to the idea of windows and doors quite a bit. He painted this work, Gypsy, in 1951 after moving to West 18th Street in New York City. And there were a number of storefronts there of fortune tellers. Now, this isn't a specific portrayal of a specific storefront, but it might have served as some inspiration. And we see a woman who is sitting, kind of looking bored, looking past us. Her arms are crossed. She's a little bit closed off to us. Maybe she's tired. Her feet are up. And just beyond her is this illuminated room. We can't really see into it because this orange curtain has been drawn. We can see other textiles and tapestries on the wall here. So there's there's this sense that, like, if she's a gypsy, that we would, if we were to get our fortune told, we would be moving behind that curtain with her. We can see just the subtle silhouette of another figure there beyond her, but there's something about the expression of her body that sort of makes it seem as though she's not totally open for business here. Now, this reclining female is a form that artists have loved throughout the centuries. And in particular, this work has often drawn associations with this famous image by the French artist Jacques-Louis David, going back to the early 1800s. And here, instead of showing like this beautiful socialite, now we have this weary looking woman working on the right. Now, this might remind you a little bit of that William Christopher work that I showed you before, because we have a similar pose over in this work. So what we'll see is there's a fair amount of cross-pollination between George Tooker and his partner's work. I think they were very much inspiring each other. Now, Tooker goes back to a theme again and again, and sometimes it seems like he might create one painting and then moves like right on to the next, which sort of seems like the next step, the next iteration. In this case, there's like 20 years separating these two paintings. So it's kind of fascinating to think about his process here. So now we have Gypsies from 1968. These women look more distinctly African American to me. The pose is very similar, although her feet are no longer up. She's joined by another woman, and now they look directly out at us. There's kind of this no-nonsense confrontation, right? It almost seems as though words have been exchanged between us and these two women. And now the shadow behind that curtain is closer, and it's pulling that curtain away, so, or to the side. So we're about to see another figure here. We don't know how things are going to unfold. There's a lot of ambiguity, and George Tooker leaves us wondering about this shadowy presence and what might happen next. Now, he clearly loves this motif of like the light coming through a curtain. We see it even as we switch gears over to windows now. This is window number 1 from 1956. This is part of a whole series of windows that he did. Now, his loft in New York City gets damaged from a fire, and that's when he and William Christopher go to Brooklyn to renovate this brownstone. It is right across from a Puerto Rican boarding house, and he becomes fascinated by kind of peering into the windows of this boarding house. He never probably directly transcribes what he sees, but it creates these kind of tantalizing ideas for him. This is very similar to Edward Hopper, who he knew, who he was associated with. And the fact that he goes back to it again and again and explores kind of sensual, sexual concepts around this too, sort of reminds me a little bit of Frida Kahlo as well. I would say like George Tooker's like a nice combination of the two of them. So here we can see this woman who's leaning on the windowsill. We've got the trompe l'oeil element of her fingers coming over the edge. She looks exhausted. She looks exasperated. Her hand is kind of supporting her forehead here. here. And we have this angularity to her arm that is echoed with the angularity of this man's arm that's standing behind the curtain. And once again, he appears as though he's just about to pull it away. We'll see his face momentarily in this beautiful light that's kind of filtering through this green shade here. And we've got that absolutely gorgeous red in the curtains and in her shirt as well. And then a third figure here, a shirtless man who's leaning up against the wall here with his hand kind of absentmindedly at his waistband here. So these kind of languishing figures here. There's there's an ambiguity in terms of how they all relate to each other, but a sense of sensuality here as well. This brings us back to our first image that we started with. This is window 2, which he actually painted from the same year. It's the same motif, but now it's like the light of day. We have a figure who's pulled back this green curtain and is looking out the window, probably down at the street. His gaze leads our eyes down to this beautiful still life down here at the bottom of the picture. We can also see that his shirt is sort of translucent. You get the sense for his body underneath that shirt. So again, a sense of sensuality here. The angularity of his pose reinforces the window format in general. George Tooker loved the window format. It essentially is a frame itself. And then finally, we just discover this other person. Looks to be a woman. She seems to be peering over the back of a bed or maybe the back of a chair. She's much lower than this man, and she seems to be looking out directly at us. It's very unnerving to me whenever I discover that little figure down there. So Tooker would sometimes show lovers through these windows. We've got our window ledge here and just kind of the suggestion of it over on the left. These red curtains make it feel like it's almost a Renaissance painting in some way, a beautiful composition with this woman's torso kind of echoing the form of the guitar in the foreground. She is in this classic position of sleep. This goes back to classical antiquity. If somebody's got their arm over their head and their eyes are closed, we know they're asleep and not dead. And then we have this beautiful figure here, kind of contemplating music, strumming his guitar. Apparently, George Tooker's art dealer suggested to him to paint in the ribbons because his buyers love that trompe-l'oeil element. So Tooker was really interested in portraying interracial couples because certainly he probably felt like he was a part of them. He was so committed to social justice, and he even portrayed couples that would imply a homosexual relationship as well. Once more, we see the poses of these figures reinforcing the frame itself or the edges of these pictures. We can see that Tooker loves to paint a torso almost as much as, say, somebody like Michelangelo did. These pictures have been associated with Renaissance depictions of Saint Sebastian. Saint Sebastian was martyred by being tied to a tree, sometimes portrayed with his arms above his head this way, and then a firing squad of archers essentially delivered his death to him. So this idea of like this shirtless or semi-nude figure with his arms above his head had almost become like this sexualized image. Saint Sebastian actually kind of became a gay icon, and this notion of suffering the slings and arrows was something that I think a lot of gay men in the 20th century could also identify with. So there's a little bit of that informing some of Tooker's works. So we're going to move from windows to doors now. And the doors can be just as ambiguous and provide more of a barricade for understanding things rather than that visual eavesdropping that we were doing before. This is a space inspired by Tooker's own apartment, and I believe it's simply called Doors. It's from 1953, and we see a semi-nude woman emerging from one door, a semi-nude figure seated in another room, and then just this brilliant light cascading through the crack of this door into the hallway. You get the sense that this is somebody who just got up to go to the bathroom and is returning to their lover, but in the end, we don't really know. And somehow it almost seems as though the light is going to draw her into this other room. It's a really ambiguous picture. It's easy for us to kind of create a narrative out of it, But like I said, in the end, there's no clear-cut way of understanding it. If this is reminding you of Edward Hopper, you're right on track. Um, George Tooker had seen Edward Hopper's painting Room by the Sea from 1951, the year that it was painted just 2 years earlier. And this is also a picture that's about an ambiguous door and light coming through. So I think there was definitely some cross-pollination when it came to Edward Hopper. But doors become uh, a, 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 a means for division in George Tooker's paintings. And oftentimes what he'll do, using a little bit of this magical realism, is essentially create two characters and put them on either side of a door. You could also understand these as walls, but they're usually thin divisions like this. The division itself almost doesn't make sense because if it was a door, clearly they could just pull it open, look around the side of it. But oftentimes what's happening is communication through this door. This is called voice one. The year is unknown. And we can see one figure in shadow with his mouth open as though he's whispering something that is urgent and aching through this door. And the other figure has pressed his ear and is very listening intently with maybe a little bit of fear in his eyes. This seems like a setup for a scary movie, doesn't it? Maybe I've seen too many scary movies. So it's George Tooker here kind of prompting us to wonder what this man is saying, what that voice sounds like. What do you think he could be saying through the wall? He returns to this concept with the painting Voice 2 from 1972. It's almost the exact same composition, now more slightly compressed, and now he's using African American figures for his characters, although the figure on the left almost looks like a ghost, and he's kind of drained the color out of the composition as well. The figure listening now really seems frightened, his eyes wide. Tooker in the next iteration sort of takes the talker out of each one of these scenes. It's the person who's heard the message kind of struggling with it alongside the door now. So we see in the image on the left, simply called Door from 1970, a man who's forcibly closing that door using his body to kind of to ensure that it's sealed off. But the look on his face, it's as though the message has been received. He's heard something that he's trying to shut out at this point. Over on the right, we see a figure in shadow. The figure on the right side of the door is now looking somewhat traumatized and anxious by what they've heard. They've become the ghost now. Ghost. So that's where things are sort of headed. George Tooker is now using the door as this division, this barricade between life and death. And now we're not seeing two exact copies of a character, but the same character perhaps in life and in death. This is a particularly haunting image. It's from 1974. It's called The Lesson. And we sort of get the sense that this woman has come back from the grave in order to deliver this kind of shrieking, terrifying moral for the woman who might still be alive, who's kind of cowering back here in the shadows. We have this striking arc of red flowers here. I always think of this as like a funerary wreath, and then all of a sudden it's like this division here becomes like a coffin door, perhaps. So George Tooker was thinking of doors as coffins as well. I think when we see this image here, we have woman at the wall and then standing figures. We can see this pose kind of replicated in this picture. And so now we've got again these kind of endless spaces, the dehumanizing architecture that is a site for grief and isolation now. So we have modern life that is compartmentalized and lonely, or perhaps this is Tooker's vision of the afterlife. But there's definitely a sense of loss and loneliness here. Sort of the next natural iteration is the door becomes a tombstone. And once again, the space and the architecture is limitless. It goes on forever. This is a surreal landscape, and it's illuminated by this lemon yellow, almost lime green light. And this seems like a resurrection almost, or revelation. Like these figures are not going into the grave, but emerging from them. Perhaps this is a reunion here. Perhaps this is a new understanding of what happens next. So in any event, we see that Tooker is taking this very simple concept of a wall or a door dividing people, and he explores it and again and again to draw these conclusions about some of the biggest divisions in our lives. So we've got very short time. I need to move even quicker now here, but we have a lighter subject now, light and love. And here we see Tooker painting a jukebox, a modern music machine that has this wonderful kind of swirling design. He uses it as a way to illuminate this languidly posed woman. And we see that swirling design echoed in the crepe paper here. So he really loves a good light source. And we'll see that again and again. We've got these beautiful paper lanterns, even though these don't particularly seem like joyful, festive celebrations, the lanterns themselves have those associations. You've been to one of my talks before, you probably remember Sargent's painting of Carnation, Lily, Lily, Rose. There is this sort of solemnity, perhaps, in both of these pictures. But I think what Tooker is thinking of is a much older tradition. The French artist Georges de la Tour, who was a Baroque artist, who was so fascinated by light sources and creating this magnificent spiritual light in his paintings. We can see almost a similar format from in George Tooker's paintings of these glowing lanterns over here on the right. Now, he also explored the theme of love. And interestingly, he did this with heterosexual relationships. I love both of these embraces. That's what they're both called. One's oriented vertically, one's oriented horizontally. In both of them, we can't see the man's face, but we see this wonderful sense of what I read as like peace and relief in the face of these women who embrace their lovers back. They're both set in these like rolling hills in a natural environment. And if you've already had the association here of one of the most famous embraces of all time, Gustav Klimt's The Kiss, I'm thinking the same thing. Notice how this woman's face is kind of craned in the same way as the woman being kissed over here in this famous painting. The idea of the embrace continues to evolve here. Now we see the man's face. The couple is clutching each other. Notice how the hands are both kind of turned upward here. They seem to be wrapped in a cloak that is simultaneously these rolling hills in the background, and just such a sense of intensity in this embrace. You almost get the sense that he recognizes this is the last time they will be embracing each other, or maybe it's the first time after a long time. One last embrace I wanted to share with you. It's almost the same face of this man. Now they've moved to the ground here. The woman's long blonde hair is very similar to the tall grasses that are around them, and they are kind of enveloped by this cloth. Maybe it's part of somebody's coat or something like this, but they've become one in this moment, and I think that these are so beautifully and sensitively rendered. But with these bodies on the ground, we're going to touch on our very last section here, which is about sleep and death. It is a little bit darker again. So we have this notion that Tooker really liked to portray sleep throughout his career. We've already seen a sleeping figure alongside a lover, but notice how he handles this issue of sleep a little bit differently here. And he begins to make us wonder whether we're dealing with sleep or death. Using that classical pose of sleep signifies what has happened in this room, but here it's a little bit more ambiguous, and he becomes fascinated by the idea of a face that's sort of ensconced by pillows and linens this way. Here we have perhaps lovers again, we don't know, or maybe this is somebody who is in mourning alongside this figure that has passed away. You've got these big dark eyes that stare off into the distance. They're watching, they're thinking, perhaps they're grieving. And then using a little bit of this magical realism once again, Tooker gives us all of these sleepers that are now awake. They are in that same position, but their eyes are open. It's almost as though they've passed into another realm, or they're stargazing. They look alarmed. They look up in wonder. It's hard to know exactly what he's imagining here. He simply calls this night. Actually, he calls this Sleepers 2 from 1959. This is at the Museum of Modern Art. So this blending of sleeping and death, well, it's pretty clear what he's thinking of with these two works called Meadow 1 and Meadow 2. He painted these works shortly after the death of his own beloved mother. And sort of like the embrace that we saw before, he cites this feeling of this true love, this true connection in a natural landscape. And so we can no doubt read this as the face of the artist himself, who looks down and away from the body of what is presumably his mother, just absolutely lost in that grief. He also was fascinated by skeletal forms, and he explored this issue of like the dance of death very early on in his career. This was an ambitious work from the 1940s. He was just 26 years old when he painted it. But essentially what we see is a crack in the sidewalk and these skeletons that have risen up from death to cause chaos in our world today. They're there to render judgment. We have this really complicated composition of X's here across the center. We have sort of the repetition of forms, these three ladies walking in unison. There's a lot of choreography. There's a lot of that sense of dread there as well. Maybe another mistress of the underworld there in the back. It's really hard to, oh, and I even have that call back there too. It's hard to get a great high resolution image of this painting, but I have a black and white one where we can see that George Tooker included himself in this painting that was cut off in the other version that I showed you. So he is someone who is always kind of contemplating his own mortality. He's painted himself in his 20s into this scene of essentially the Last Judgment. And so throughout his career, he returns back to this notion of the vanitas. It's an age-old theme in the history of art, of like the passing of beauty, the brevity of our lives. So we have this beautiful young woman who is thinking of her own beauty, but of course is sort of haunted by the specter of death behind her. Tooker goes back to it again and again. Sometimes he includes the skull, sometimes he doesn't. Here we have the flower with the petals kind of falling off. Again, that indicator that this too will pass, that her beauty is only of the moment. Here he suggests that by having the older figure peeking over the shoulder. Is it her older self? Is it her grandmother? He leaves it just ambiguous enough for us to decide. And so it seems like a natural conclusion that Tooker himself would create his own self-portrait with death just behind him here. He created this in 1966. He's no longer casually observing death from a distance, as we saw in the Dance with Death before. In this work, death has crept right up behind him and is about to lay that bony finger on his shoulder. Tooker has presented himself as slightly smiling, maybe just a little bit ill at ease, perhaps coming to terms with what he knows is his fate. So we will wrap up very quickly with George Tooker's legacy. He lived to the age of 90. He passed away in 2011 at his home in Heartland, Vermont. Over the course of his long career, he created less than 175 works because of this slow, methodical process of his. He had several major exhibitions at very large museums during his lifetime, including multiple retrospectives at major US museums. In 2007, he received the prestigious National Medal of Arts. Here from George Bush, we can see. So as we wrap up thinking about George Tooker, we think of him as an artist who used these luminous colors and light to illustrate how people should act towards each other, and painted the consequences of what happens when they don't do that. He pushed the boundaries on topics that were important to him, including social justice and equality, but did it in his often understated ways. He remains one of the most distinctive, most underappreciated American artists of the 20th century. So thank you so much for spending your hour with me to learn a little bit more about George Tooker. I hope you're just aching to see more of his work. And I can start looking at the chat and the Q&A if anybody has any questions about him. Let's see. Oh, Margot is asking about his background, his ethnicity. It says his mother, the bio on him lists his mother as Cuban, but of various European background, including Spanish, not Hispanic, and his father is white. So how does he consider himself mixed race or a person of color? That's a really good question. Perhaps her Cuban background was something that she really shared with him, and perhaps he just felt like it set him apart in some way. But yes, I think you're probably right in sort of nailing down the fact that he might not be mixed race in the same way that we would think of it today. And Elena says, many of us have seen terrible things in the subway. The subways are terrifying places, aren't they? They can be. They can also be places where, strangers lift up baby carriages for you. You never know. And that's part of the anxiety, right? It's like you never know how people are going to behave underground. Nancy says, I wish I could take you around with me to museums. Oh, you're so sweet, Nancy. Someday we'll do that. And Judith says he uses orange and grid lines frequently. Yes, those oranges tend to be so luminous too, right? It seems to be sort of like a sweet spot for him. And you're good to notice the grid lines. I don't know if I've noticed them myself. Anne, thanks so much for your kind words. She said, I'd never heard of Tooker before. I would not want his paintings hanging in my house. They're like bad dreams. I agree with that. Some of them are beautiful. I do love those embrace pictures so much. Those are lovely. They're so heartfelt, aren't they? That hands that embrace reminds me of the new sculpture of the embrace in Boston. Nancy, oh, what a great connection there. The Martin Luther King Jr. sculpture in Boston. I think he would be so proud to have that association because he so admired King. Margot made the connection to the memento mori and sort of like Dutch still lifes, right? With those, with these Vanitas pictures that we were looking at. I think we got to everything here. Oh, everybody's loves the fascinating, haunting, luminous paintings of George Tooker. Thank you so much for your kind words, everybody. I'm so glad you enjoyed it and you learned a little bit more. Oh, Alicia says, I see elements of Hieronymus Bosch in the first painting, especially the crouching figure on the left. I could absolutely see what you're saying there. And even with like the Dance of Death as well, there's just a lot going on in some of these pictures. So, almost like the artist's imagination of how terrifying hell could be too. That's a really, I think, profound connection that you just made, Alicia. I love that. Judy, thank you for your kind words. Suzanne says, is his remarkable luminosity achieved only from egg tempera? I think you can achieve it in other forms. I'm thinking if like Kehinde Wiley could achieve that kind of luminosity in some of his paintings, their oil paintings. I think it's pretty unusual actually to achieve that level of luminosity in egg yolk tempera, which I think tends to dry like a little bit. I think of it as like more muted colors in general. So I think it's like a testament to his extraordinary capabilities and just how diligent he was with this medium. Diana, I agree with you. She says, a most fantastic, fascinating painter. I'm fascinated by his works. And I love somebody that returns to a theme and can reshape it and reinterpret it and change it over time this way. Thank you, everybody, for your very kind words. I really appreciate it. I hope everybody has a fantastic Thanksgiving, and I look forward to seeing you all soon. I know some of you are tune in for the evening presentations with the Chelmsford Public Library. So that's coming up in just a week.
I
And
got
that's
you covered, Jane. I got you
for
covered. So that is going to be next Thursday, November 21st at 7 o'clock. Rembrandt and Vermeer, Masters of the Dutch Baroque. And I'm going to put the registration link in the chat. And I'll also include the registration link in the follow-up email I send out this afternoon. Sorry to interrupt, Jane.
No, you're perfect. Thank you. Thank you again, everybody, for your time and attention. I appreciate it. Have a great rest of the day. Happy Thanksgiving.
You're the best, Jane. So folks, make sure to take the feedback survey when you exit and look for the follow-up email later today. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.